In this video, I'm going to discuss some of the basic effects that your choice of focal length can have on your images. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Now, it feels like forever since I've had a chance to talk about photography without reviewing a piece of gear, so in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about focal length choice and some of the simple effects that it can have on our images. I was recently lucky enough to spend a couple of weeks in Arunachal Pradesh in India with some of the finest lenses that money can buy or that good friendship can allow you to borrow. So those are the GF 55mm f1.7, the GF 80mm f1.7 and the GF 110mm f2. And since I was there working on my Tattoos of Asia project, I was making a lot of portraits with these lenses, so in this video I'd like to discuss the results that I got from each of the lenses and the differences in the way that I chose to use them. For this trip, I was working with my GFX 100S, and as I've done the entire way through this project, a single strobe to give some consistency to the light in my images. Now, in the past, I've taken a Westcott Apollo Octa or a Photex soft lighter with me, but this time I was traveling alone, and that sort of setup is just that little bit too cumbersome when you're working in small spaces or in any sort of wind. So I decided to put my 8200 through a small SMDV softbox instead this time, and I'll link to that softbox below in case anybody's interested in the exact one that I was using. Now, the great thing about the Godox system is that when paired with the GFX, I'm able to use high-speed sync, which means I can get past that 1/125th of a second sync speed limitation that you have on the GFX. And basically what that means is I can get consistent looking images at any time of day in any location. And it really works well for a project like this one where I'm constantly on the go and I really don't know when and where I'm going to meet the people I photograph. It's something that I have no control over. So with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at some of the images and discuss some of the lens choices that I made. Now, this video will be about the way that I approach using lenses and not necessarily a full-blown tutorial, but I hope that there are, some tidbits of information in there that can be useful to you. The first image I want to look at is from my trusty GF 110mm f2. Now, this lens is the entire reason I bought into the GFX system and not one of the other full-frame systems that are on the market. Now, I absolutely adore the images that I get from it, and I've photographed hundreds and hundreds of people for this project using it. Now, the working distance of that longer focal length of 110mm means that anything you photograph will render just a little bit flatter than what you might interpret with your eyes because of the distance between you and the subject. Now, it also cuts out a lot of clutter with its narrow field of view, which makes it the perfect lens for this project. One of the portraits I take for almost every subject I photograph for Tattoos of Asia is a close-up portrait on a simple background. Now, I always take a small piece of cloth with me in case we can't find an appropriate background in the field, and the 110mm allows me to basically crop out the surroundings easily and focus just on that background. Now, as you can see with this photograph, I'm able to get a tight head and shoulders portrait without distorting the face at all. The lady's features remain in good proportion, and nothing is really feeling out of place here. Also, shooting at f2 allows me an extremely shallow depth of field and takes your attention right to her eyes before allowing you to explore the rest of the image. Now, for me, this razor-sharp detail and the beautiful way in which this lens sort of falls out of focus in front and behind is one of the things that really contributes to the overall look of images that it produces. Also, because I'm able to step back from the subject somewhat, it tends to render in a very flattering perspective as well. So for most subjects, this is generally what I'm aiming for this project. Just a representation of who they are without distorting it in any way. If we compare that to a portrait shot with a similar subject size on the GF 80mm f1.7, we can see that there's a little bit more perspective distortion since the 80mm requires me to get just that little bit closer to the subject. Now, this is easily visible by looking at the traditional headpiece the lady is wearing, which does appear a little bit larger than it should, and the same can be said for her nose, which also sees a slight increase in size compared to what you might perceive with your eyes. Now, also, if you look at where her ears and body appear to be, they seem to be ever so slightly further back than the image that I made with the 110mm lens. And again, that's just to do with the relative distance between me and the subject and the lens to those particular objects in the frame. Actually, these are the main reasons that I purchased the GF 80mm. Now, I usually have enough space to work with the 110mm on these trips, but I wanted a lens that would allow me to give the feeling that I'm right in there, close with my subjects. And sometimes the 110mm focal length can feel just a little bit distant and impersonal. Even though the images are very flattering, they lack that sort of connection with the photographer at times, just because of the way that they render. The other reason I decided to invest in the GF 80mm was the ability to take in a little bit more of the scene while still maintaining that really shallow depth of field. Now, when I first borrowed the GFX50S from Fujifilm for this project, I was also provided with the GF 63mm f2.8. Now, I loved the rendering that lens provided, and the field of view was great for getting in just a little bit more of the scene around my subject. But there were times when I wanted to, isolate the subject just in a sea of bokeh, and I really ended up having to get in close and photograph a panorama just to achieve that look. With the 80mm though, I'm able to do that in a single frame. Now, as you can see here, the separation is really something special. Now, the subject remains tack sharp, while the background is simply obliterated. It just disappears into a mess of bokeh. Now, this doesn't work for every image, of course, but in a shot like this, which will probably end up as a double-page spread in my book, this is a really great way to make the subject just stand out from that background without having any distractions at all. The GF 55mm f1.7 is also able to achieve this sort of separation when working in close and shooting wide open, but I often found myself wanting to stop down a couple of stops just to show a little bit more detail in the background. Now, the main difference with the 55mm for me is that the field of view is just wide enough to take in quite a bit of the scene, and it can allow the diagonal lines to have a little bit more power to them in the composition. Now, in a scene like this, the 55mm allows me to use the lines of the house to draw you into the subject. Now, if I'd used the lens wide open here, the house would have just been a blurry mess, much like the previous image that I showed with the 80mm. So stopping down allows me to not only show a little bit more detail in the house, but also to use it as a line to draw you across the image. Now, again, if I'd photographed this image with the 80mm or the 110mm, the scene would have been a lot more squashed together, a lot more compressed from front to back, and I would have lost the sense of depth since I'd need to move back further away from both the house and my subject to get the composition. Here's another example of a time when I made use of the 55mm focal length, but this time wide open. Now, I could have used the 80mm or the 110mm here to take in a tighter crop of the scene and remove the bright areas on the left of the image. But if I'd done that, I'd lose the feeling of sort of looking down from the top of the steps in front of the house, and also the way that the house recedes into the background. So with either of the longer lenses, I'd have squashed everything together and lost a little bit of depth in the scene again. I hope that you enjoyed this short look at a few images from my recent trip to India and the thoughts that went into choosing the lens to use for each portrait. Now, if you'd like to see more of these sorts of videos, or perhaps maybe a deep dive into one of these images, please do let me know in the comments below. But for now, thanks for watching and enjoy the slideshow.